Okay, this is a review of Chapter 11, Introduction to Criminology, Labeling Theory, and Conflict, Marxist, and other radical theories of crime. Whoop whoop! Alright, this one's a fun one. So we're going to summarize the foundational ideas of labeling theory, go through basic assumptions, criticisms, key features of consensus view of law. We're going to talk about some of the conservative, pluralist, and critical radical perspectives. Yay! Marxist theory. Talk about, a lot of the key contributors to alternative perspectives like peacemaking criminology, restorative justice perspective, and left realism. Fun stuff. And then we'll end off with policy implications, as per usual. Okay, labeling theory, yay! So, labeling theory is one of those ones, if you've heard nothing about criminological thought, you've probably still maybe heard about labeling theory. This came to the forefront during a time when various assumptions concerning societal authority were being questioned and re examined. So, the perspective focuses on questions like who applies a deviant label to whom, and who establishes and enforces the rules. So, it's important to understand how criminal or deviant behavior is defined or labeled. So the scholars in this chapter are interested in how society reacts to labeled behavior. So the foundation of labeling theory is influenced by symbolic interactionism. So symbolic interactionism focuses on an individual's personality and thought processes that evolve through social interactions. So this can be language, this can be gestures, but really what it is that the idea of symbolic interaction is we create meaning when we interact. All right, Charles Horton Cooley, among other things, talked about how an individual gains a sense of their self through primary groups or significant others. Now, significant others in sociology just means those people that socialized you. It doesn't mean like your boo thing, right? But anyway, so Cooley identified the processes of individuals obtaining a self-image through the eyes of others as what he called the looking glass self. So this idea that you kind of look at other people as a mirror to mirror back to you whether or not what you're doing or who you are or how you're acting is appropriate and accepted or not, right? So we kind of look to others as a mirror. William I. Thomas was, years later, concerned specifically with the adult self and how it's redefined, and argued that we don't just get socialized as kids or young adults, we're socialized through a whole lifespan. So he says that, we're often re-socialized into new situations as we grow. So to understand human behavior, we also have to understand what are called total situations, which consists of subjective factors as well as an individual's subjective definition of those factors. So, he even talks about like total institutions, things that basically control every aspect of your lived experience, right? So total situation is just all the factors of how we interpret the space that we're living in, the kind of definition of the situation. And then George Herbert Mead, along with developing a lot of theories about child development that we'll talk about later, he looked at two types of social interaction: non-symbolic interaction and symbolic interaction. So non-symbolic interaction occurs when individuals respond to gestures or actions, and symbolic interaction is when we interpret others' gestures and act based on those meanings of those interactions. So he was a symbolic interactionist, and he was concerned with the interpretation of meanings and actions of what other people are doing, and really the definitions or conveying indications to other people about how you're supposed to act. So an essential component of symbolic interactionism is that individuals who are stigmatized as being deviant are predisposed to take on a deviant self-identity, right? The idea being like, oh, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad. So then you kind of take that on and go, oh, I'm bad, I'll show you how bad I am, right? And Goffman is the one who brought us the understanding of stigma. Stigma is an attribute that deeply discredits and diminishes an individual from the whole unusual person, a tainted, discounted person. So think about it this way, right? Like when someone's stigmatized, like there's like that one weird kid in your class when you're growing up. When someone's stigmatized, if you hang out with them, then you're afraid that the stigma that they have might spread to you, right? So, Goffman said that stigmatized individuals differ from normal people in terms of how society reacts to them. Okay, another important thinker to understand labeling theory is Frank Tannenbaum, who wrote Crime in the Community in 1938, and many scholars identify this as the origin of labeling perspective. So he focused on the processes that occur after an individual's been caught and designated as violating the law. So there's a gradual shift from the definition of the specific act as evil to the definition of the individual as evil. He also looked at the dramatization of evil, or the community's point of view or social reaction to illegal behavior. The process of making a criminal involves the process of tagging, defining, and identifying an individual, and what results from that is the person becoming the thing they were labeled as, or they were described as being. So the first dramatization of evil has a greater influence on making it a criminal than any other experience. So he argues that acts are not inherently good or bad, they are differing degrees of good or bad, and social reactions are what influence how behaviors are labeled. So these behaviors are placed within a context that includes such factors as a person's social status and the social setting, right? So why is it that gender impacts what we consider right and wrong for behavior? Or social status, that we let rich people get away with stuff that we don't let poor people get away with. And this is especially the case with when you look at young men that are, acting up. Like, let's say the school to prison pipeline. You're looking at young men being deviant in school. For young men of color, this could mean, instead of going to the principal, going to, juvenile court. While for more affluent men, young men, and especially white affluent young men, this means a slap on the wrist or maybe a detention, but not any engagement with the juvenile court system. So your social status and your social setting affects, the kind of social reactions people have to your behavior. Okay, so Lemert, you got primary deviance, secondary deviance. So he basically says primary deviance is a behavior that's situational or occasional, and that people use excuses or rationalizations for their deviant behavior. So this process is done through normalization or through minimal controls, which do not hinder individuals from getting along with each other. So a person engaging in primary deviant behavior perceives the behavior as bad, but they don't see themselves as bad. While secondary deviance is different. So deviant behavior or social roles based on it can become a means of defense, attack, or adaptation to the overt and covert problems created by the societal reaction to primary deviation. A person engaging in secondary deviant behavior uses their behavior as a way to defend or adjust to the various problems related to the social reactions of this behavior. So the sequence of interactions that results in secondary deviation essentially consists of primary deviation, social penalties, further primary deviation, stronger penalties, further deviation, crisis reaching the tolerance quotient, which is expressed in formal action by the community stigmatizing this person as deviant. And that makes the deviant even more strengthened in being in deviant conduct and stigmatizing, getting more stigmatized. So you see the pattern here. The whole idea here is that we punish this person, we make them stigmatized, you say, you're bad, you're a bad kid. And the more we yell at them and call them a bad kid, the more they become a bad kid. So maybe the ways in which we have to reevaluate how we punish and deal with, these kind of things. Yes, people need to be told that they're doing something wrong. Yes, people need to have some control over their behaviors. But at the same time, they really need to also be connected back to the mainstream society so that they have some integration and more opportunity to reform and not become more deviant. Okay, this connects to Becker. In his book Outsiders, Studies on the Sociology of Deviance in 1963, the term outsiders, according to Becker, refers to individuals who are considered by others to be deviant, and these labeled individuals are considered to be outside the circle of normal members of the group. So social groups create deviance by making the rules whose infraction is considered deviance, and by applying those rules to particular people and labeling those people as outsiders. So a key aspect to labeling deviance is to realize that certain groups have the power to impose rules on others, and other groups just don't, right? So some people have power, they can label other people, label other groups, and other people have none of that power. So this power differential results in those groups with authority to designate over other individuals as deviants and outsiders. And he also says that deviance has two dimensions. Only those behaviors that are considered deviant by others are really deviant, and whether a behavior or act conforms to a certain rule. So let me give you a little example there. Only behaviors which are considered deviant by others are really deviant. So for instance, drunk driving, that's deviant. But there was a time in American society, pre-1960s, where drunk driving was just a thing that people did. People drank too much and drove. It was just considered normal, right? So, I think it's interesting if you actually look back on YouTube, there's footage at the time of news reports when they're trying to put in these DUI laws. The people are saying, what's the big deal? Like, just because, I get off of work, I just want a couple beers before I drive home. Like, what's the big deal? Right? So it's interesting just to see how, that would not be the argument we'd have today, right? Because nowadays we've considered that deviant, and it nowadays considered very deviant, right? But there was a time period where it wasn't considered deviant. Just like if you gave your child cocaine, that'd be considered very deviant. But in the 1800s, cocaine was available in tooth numbing products for babies, right? So you basically just take some cocaine and put it on their gums so that when they were teething, their gums wouldn't hurt so bad. Nowadays, you gave a baby cocaine, that's deviant. But in a time period where it was just considered like another medical thing to give a baby, wasn't deviant. Does that make sense? So deviance is only considered deviant when other people think it's deviant. And whether a behavior acts or an act conforms to a rule is what makes it deviant or not. Becker developed a typology of deviant behavior, and you see the kind of visual of it here on the slide at the bottom here. So he has conforming behavior, which obeys the rules and society perceives that person as obeying the rules. You have pure deviant, a person who disobeys the rules and is perceived as disobeying the rules. You have falsely accused, which is an individual identified as disobeying the rules, but they didn't disobey the rules. And then you have the secret deviant, an individual who violates the rules of society, but society does not react to that behavior. I think that's like corporate crime, or examples like that, where we kind of ignore these incredibly impactful negative consequences that come from these very, very wealthy people, manipulating things in their own interests. So that's kind of Becker's typology there. Okay, moving on to Schur and another kind of labeling theory theorist, and he's trying to address some of the criticisms and misunderstandings of the labeling perspective. So he noted that some scholars maintain the perspective fails to distinguish adequately between deviance and non-deviance. So the labeling perspective really attempts to explain the varieties of deviant experiences rather than just, okay, did this person commit a deviant act or not, or how many times can we count this person doing it? So there's various criticisms that argue that labeling perspective is too narrow, right? Because the focus is on the deviant status rather than what motivated them to commit crime in the first place. So one reason for the confusion and controversy is the failure of labeling theorists to provide a concise definition of deviance that can be used when conducting research. So Schur provided the following definition, quote, human behavior is deviant to the extent that it comes to be viewed as involving a personally discreditable departure from a group's normative expectation, and it elicits interpersonal or collective reactions that serve to isolate, treat, correct, or punish individuals engaged in such behavior, end quote. So the term deviant and delinquent are what sociologists designate as an ascribed status and not an achieved status. So key factors in the labeling process are stereotyping, retrospective interpretation, and negotiation. So stereotyping usually is associated with racial prejudice and discrimination. Stereotyping can occur in police encounters with juveniles. So during the various decision-making stages of these encounters, whether or not they decide to incarcerate a kid, to charge a kid, to prosecute a kid, right? Whether police decide, oh, we'll just let this kid go. And how they react is going to be affected by the youth's group affiliations. What's their age? What's their race? What's their grooming? What's their dress? What's their demeanor? And then, of course, what he didn't mention, but also it matters very much, what's their gender? Retrospective interpretation is another factor. So this is the process by which an individual is identified as a deviant and is thereafter viewed differently, like viewed in a new light after they're like, oh, that person's deviant. So through this process, an individual is given a new personal identity. And the most dramatic way of initiating this process is through a public status degradation ceremony. So, such as a criminal trial itself is a status degradation ceremony that basically takes a person from normal citizen to deviant criminal, and can obviously affect their self-identification and the way that they develop their own personal identity. Now, negotiation is that alleged delinquents may try to influence their disposition by exploiting the relationship between the image they're presenting and the probable outcome of their case. So some of the basic assumptions of labeling theory is that no act is intrinsically criminal, right? It's how people react to that act, right? So pollution, is it inherently criminal? I would say so, but the EPA allows a certain amount of pollution, right? Or many corporations just get away with that stuff and aren't actually criminally enforced. Criminal definitions are enforced in the interest of the powerful, right? The idea that the laws are written and reinforced through these mechanisms in Congress, and largely as Congress are filled with millionaires and the people that fund their campaigns are millionaires and billionaires, that oftentimes the interests of those most wealthy and powerful people are the ones that shape the way that we then interpret the laws, which then can really negatively impact the middle class and the poor people that aren't in power. Okay, another assumption is a person does not become criminal by violating the law. It's really that they become criminal by the way that they're labeled, right? They're labeled as criminal, so therefore they're criminal. Like, for instance, speeding on the freeway. Does speeding on the freeway make you a criminal? No. But does getting caught speeding on the freeway make you a criminal? Yes. Right? So doing it itself is not necessarily the problem. It's getting caught. Okay, the practice of dichotomizing individuals into criminal and non-criminal groups is contrary to common sense and research. Another argument is that only a few people are caught violating the law, even though many may be equally guilty. So the penalties, let me back up, that the sanctions used in law enforcement are directed against the individual and not just the criminal act. So the penalties for an act have to vary according to the characteristics of the offender. So unfortunately, your age, your race, your social class, your gender, these things are going to be impacts on, kind of how savable you are, how redeemable you are considered, how much you should get a second chance. Okay, some more basic assumptions of labeling theory is that criminal sanctions will also vary according to other characteristics of the offender. Also, that criminal justice is founded on stereotype conception of the criminal as pariah. So a pariah is a willful wrongdoer who's morally bad and deserves the community's condemnation. We don't really know that that's the case, right? Again, this kind of goes back to that thing we were talking about in the very beginning of okay, a person committed a crime, but why did they do it? What was the mens rea, right? So, you stole? But you stole so your baby could have formula? Or you stole because you just wanted the thrill of stealing, right? That should kind of matter, and that sometimes people commit crimes not because they're bad people, but because they really have a lack of opportunities and other resources, and they're kind of up against a wall, right? So, but the notion we have in society is that a criminal is a pariah. They're a willful wrongdoer, they're bad people, they should be locked up and condemned, right? And then another basic assumption of labeling theory is that confronted by public condemnation and the label of an evil man, it may be difficult for an offender to maintain a favorable image of themselves, right? So that makes sense. If people are like, you're bad, you're evil, you're terrible, then you might start to internalize that and start to believe that about yourself. Okay, so just briefly, some of the research on labeling theory really tries to study, in an empirical way, whether or not, whether or not this is the case. And they use a lot of different research methods to try and do this. So a lot of research has focused on, how does someone become labeled? Is there a deviance amplification process after you're labeled? Schwartz and Skolnick looked at the effect of an employee's criminal court record and the reaction of potential employers. Interestingly, they found that only one employer demonstrated an interest in anyone that had been convicted. They had 3 people that were tried but acquitted and actually had, some callback. and 6 in the try and acquitted with letter from a judge group, while 9 in the non-criminal record folder were contacted. So the idea being that even if you had a letter from a judge, hey, I was acquitted, I didn't do anything wrong, I was wrongfully convicted, you're still way less likely to be able to get a job. And like, let me just be real, judges don't just be giving you letters that say that usually, so that's pretty rare. Also, Rosenhan examined the label of insanity and how that can influence behavior and perceptions by staff. So basically he sent like grad students into a facility and said like, hey, I'm having visions, I'm hearing voices, and seeing how many of them were they pretended to be hearing voices, and see how many of them were labeled as schizophrenic. All but one of them were. Even when they were questioned about their backgrounds and gave all truthful and accurate responses. The idea is if you go to a mental hospital, that you're insane. It's kind of that thing when people are in prison and they say, I'm innocent, and you go, sure, everyone says that. It's like you're in a mental hospital and you're like, I'm not insane, and they're like, sure, you're not. Because the power of the institution itself does that. There's a great Futurama episode of that where Fry gets put into a robot mental facility, and the problem is that he thinks he's not a robot because he isn't a robot, right? And then eventually they convince him that he is a robot and he's sane, and he's released, and now he's insane because he's actually not a robot. So anyway, that kind of idea that sometimes the bias that can come through, right, when you're in contact with a certain institution, it can seem like, well, that must be you must be insane or you wouldn't be there, or you must be a criminal or you wouldn't have been locked up. So some critiques of labeling theory is that it's not adequately tested in some regards, that there's not enough empirical research evaluating the adequacy of labeling theory, that it focuses on the reaction to criminal or deviant behavior, but it avoids the question of causation, like why they committed the crime in the first place. And it focuses on, again, reactors rather than actors. So labeling should be viewed as a perspective rather than a theory, because in the strictest sense, it's not necessarily a theory because it focuses specifically on the act of labeling itself. Okay, moving on to conflict perspectives. There's various conflict theoretical perspectives, and they all share a critical position concerning the existing social order. They differ, though, as to their conceptualization of the nature of the social order. So generally, there's two forms of conflict theory: conservative or pluralistic, and critical radical. So we're going to start with conservative or pluralist conflict perspectives. So the primary focus of conservative or pluralist conflict theories is power and the use of that power. So this theoretical framework views society as consisting of diverse interests of interest groups that are competing for power. So Vold has his group conflict theory that he introduced in the book Theoretical Criminology in 1958. So a key aspect to group conflict theory is recognizing the social process view of society as a collection of various groups that are held together in a dynamic equilibrium of opposing group interests and efforts. So the social process involves a continuing struggle to maintain, enhance, and keep basically the position of one's group within the context of other groups that are competing for control. So conflict is an essential component to the social process. So this is maintaining that process of lawmaking, law breaking, law enforcement. This reflects essential and fundamental conflicts between the group interest as well as struggles among groups for control of state power. Group conflict theory focuses on one of those situations for which criminal behavior is a result of conflicting group interests. So the type of crime includes crimes arising from political protest, crimes resulting from labor disputes, crimes arising from disputes within and between competing unions, and crimes arising from racial and ethnic clashes. An importance of Vold's contribution is that it offered an explanation of understanding crime, which we call critical criminology. Okay, moving on to Turk in his book Criminology and Legal Order in 1969, he stated that, quote, nothing and no one is intrinsically criminal. Criminality is a definition applied by individuals with the power to do so according to a legal and extra-legal as well as legal criteria, end quote. So society is characterized by conflict arising between various groups seeking to establish control over one another. And they maintain that social order is based on consensus, coercion balance, maintained by authorities. So Turk's theory of criminalization, or the process of being labeled as criminal, occurs throughout the interaction between those who enforce the law and those who violate the law. So this interaction is influenced by various social factors. One of them is the congruence of cultural and social norms. Another is social factors. Those two additional social factors are the level of organization and the level of sophistication of both the authorities and the subjects. So conflict is more likely when both authorities and subjects are organized. Another social factor is the power differential between enforcers and violators. Criminalization will most likely occur when the enforcers, i.e. the police, the prosecutors, the judges, have a great deal of power compared to the resistors, right? People that are poor and marginal. So the realism of motives is another essential social factor. Conflict will most likely occur when either the enforcers or resistors engage in inappropriate or unsuitable behavior. So he stressed the importance of nonpartisan conflict theory, where he maintained the ideological position of the political utilities or theories are irrelevant when assessing the validity of knowledge claims. All right, Quinney is another conservative pluralist conflict perspective dude who came up with 6 propositions that describe social reality of crime. Proposition 1 is the definition of crime. Crime is a definition of human conduct that's created by authority or authorized agents in a politically organized society. Proposition 2 is the formulation of criminal definitions. Criminal definitions describe behaviors that conflict with the interests of the segments of society that have the power to shape political policy. Proposition 3 is application of criminal definitions. Criminal definitions are applied by the segments of society that have the power to shape the enforcement and administration of criminal law. Proposition 4. Development of behavioral patterns in relation to criminal definitions. Behavioral patterns are structured in segmentally organized society in relation to criminal definitions, and within the context, persons engage in actions that have relative probabilities of being defined as criminal. Proposition 5 is the construction of criminal conceptions. So conceptions of crime are constructed and diffused in the segments of society by various means of communication. And last up is Proposition 6, the social reality of crime, which is constructed by the formulation and application of criminal definitions, the development of behavior patterns related to criminal definitions, and the construction of criminal conceptions. Okay, moving on to the fun ones, the radical conflict perspectives. So this theoretical framework views contemporary society as being dominated by a unified capitalist ruling class. So criminologists within this perspective have covered a broad range of topics, but regardless of their positions, the recent radical conflict perspectives can all be traced back to the influences of Karl Marx and Marxism. So Marx's criminology is greatly influenced by the poor economic conditions following the Industrial Revolution. If you don't know much about Marx, then you must not have taken another sociology class. His whole deal was those who have and those who don't, the power of those. Basically, I mean, this is an oversimplification of what he said, but basically society is divided into 2 classes. The superior, the class, the one that has all the money and the power, the very rich, what we call the bourgeoisie, right? These are the people who own the means of production. In Marx's time, that meant own the factories, right? In our time, it would be like own the corporations or sat on their boards. The subordinate class are the proletariat. These are the workers, the ones who work for those who own the means of production. So basically, the bourgeoisie are the rich, the proletariat are the workers. So Marx talked about class consciousness, which is an awareness of the common interest among members of a social class. Basically understanding that we're all being screwed by the rich. That's that 99% 1% thing that came out of the Occupy Wall Street movement that made us realize that overwhelmingly, even people that make over $400,000 a year and people that make less than $30,000 a year are actually a lot closer in lifestyle and in kind of social experience than people who make again millions of dollars, sometimes a day. It's such a different social class, the bourgeoisie. They have so much power, and really a lot of the decision making in society is concentrated within the hands of those very few people. So false consciousness is not being aware of this, and it's really wanting to be rich, right? Letting the proletariat is often swayed to follow the bourgeoisie and to find their lifestyles and their values as the ones that we want to interpret as our own, right? So for instance, like if you're super into the Kardashians, and not because you like slow motion train wrecks, but because you actually like look up to them and want to be vapid plastic billionaires, right? That's false consciousness. That's this idea that, you want to maintain the capitalist system because maybe someday you'll be rich and maybe then you can exploit other people and you just can't wait to exploit other people. So you want to keep the system the way that it is. So maybe someday you can be the exploiter instead of the exploited, right? But really you're just serving the interests of the bourgeoisie. So generally criminologists have incorporated Marxist ideology in 3 ways. First, they've maintained that law is a tool of the ruling class. Second, they argue that all crime in capitalist countries is a product of class struggle. And third, that scholars need to address the relationships between the mode of production and understanding crime. Okay, so some specifics. You got William Chambliss and Robert Seidman in their book Law, Order, and Power use a Marxist perspective to provide critical understanding of the American justice system. They argued that the myth of the consensus perspective regarding the operation of the law includes concepts such as it represents the values of society as a majority, or it operates through a value-neutral government, which is controlled by the people and serves the best interests of society. But from a conflict perspective, Chambliss and Seidman stressed that society is made up of various groups that are in conflict, and the law is a tool for those in power, i.e. the ruling class, which functions as a coercive power in conflict. So they maintain the relationship between power and the use of law extends to various institutions, such as the legislature, to law enforcement, and especially appellate courts. So in additional explanations of crime using Marxist frameworks, you have Colvin and Pauli's integrated structural Marxist theory. So that maintains that structures of control have various patterns associated with work, families, school, and peer groups, and that those patterns form the mechanisms for the reproduction of the social class structure. So the socialization and discipline practices of parents and their children are influenced by their workplace experience. So the idea is working class parents have unstable work environments. So they're more likely to experience coercive control, meaning those parents are going to enforce and even, sometimes, erratic control that can fluctuate between being very, very punitive and very, very lax. So parents of the working class who are characterized by more steady long-term employment will have more utilitarian compliance with structure in the family. And parents who are characterized as white-collar workers tend to, reinforce a more middle-class value system of compliance and positive bonds with their children. So again, the idea is parents are just trying to create, basically prepare their children for the world that they're going to live in. And poor parents are creating, preparing their children to live in a world where they're not going to have the same opportunities. So such socialization and discipline practices influence delinquent behavior. And there are significant positive associations between more physical and punitive parental discipline practices and delinquent behavior. So this perspective begins with structural Marxist perspective, which begins with the premise that social relations are grounded in the process of capitalist material production. So it incorporates aspects of learning theory, strain theory, control theory, and labeling theory. And then in their book, Adolescent Subcultures and Delinquency, Hermann Schwendiger and Julia Seigel-Schwendiger incorporated a Marxist framework to explain adolescent subcultures and delinquency. They argued that previous theoretical explanations of delinquency are inadequate and maintain that it's essential to incorporate structural conditions, especially economic, under which certain peer groups develop and promote delinquent behavior. So Stephen Spitzer kind of added to this and applied a Marxian perspective to understanding deviance and argued that one of the most essential functions of the superstructure of a capitalist society is the regulation and management of problem populations. These groups are problems when they question or disturb the following. Either a capitalist mode of approaching the product of human labor. So basically when the poor steal from the rich, that's a problem, even though the rich routinely steal from the poor and we call it capitalism. The second one is the social conditions under which capitalist production takes place. So meaning those who refuse to provide their labor to the capitalist class, or those who just can't, are unable to. Another one is patterns of distribution and consumption in capitalist society. So that really means those who, instead of buying all the shit that society says we're supposed to buy and, getting into all the pop culture-y bullshit, you instead maybe use drugs to escape or transcend rather than just try to sociably adjust. Another one is the process of socialization for productive and non-productive roles. So this just means youth who refuse to be schooled or who deny the validity of family life. And the last one is the ideology which supports the functioning of capitalist society. So this just means the proponents of alternative forms of social organization. So when looking at different conflict theories, research has, kind of fallen into two different approaches, either studies examining the laws and how they might be formulated in the interest in those in power, and studies examining the differential processing of certain individuals in the criminal justice system. So clearly we can see that laws have often been formulated in the interest of those in power. I mean, just look at the past, it's very obvious to see. But another really obvious example we'll talk about later in this class is the 100-to-1 rule. Right? This was something in the war on drugs that basically said crack cocaine and powder cocaine, the sentencing criteria differences were 100-to-1. So if you had 5 grams of crack cocaine, that was a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in prison. Or if you had 500 grams of powder cocaine, it was the same sentence. Now, who do we associate with crack cocaine? Low income, people of color. Even though disproportionately it's white people that use crack cocaine more than anyone else. Who do we associate with powder cocaine? Rich people, rich white people. So why is it that their law created by Congress would say if you have 5 grams, a very small amount in your pocket of crack cocaine, you get a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence, because we're associating that with poor people of color. And if you have 500 grams, i.e. an entire suitcase full of powder cocaine, you get the same sentence. So Obama, during those Obama years, tried to alleviate this difference, and they were able to knock it down to 18-to-1, which is still not 1-to-1, turns out. But arguably better than 100-to-1. But you can see how the law itself was clearly formulated in the interest of those in power, those rich, wealthy Wolf of Wall Street folks that do a lot of powder cocaine. So, and of course, we can see the differential processing of people in the justice system, meaning your age affects it, your racial or your ethnicity affects this, your social class affects it, your race or ethnicity affects it, your social class affects it. And many research studies have really shown a disproportionate amount of people of color are locked up. When you look at the likelihood of arrest, right, when it comes to the huge discrepancies between white men and black men, right, where black men are 1 in 3, the likelihood of being locked up in prison in one's lifetime is 1 in 3, which is incredibly high. And again, when you look at African Americans comprising about 13% of the population, but comprising a much larger share of the prison population. So we can see clearly there's some sort of issue there with differential processing of people in the criminal justice system. Some critiques on conflict perspectives goes back to Vold, that guy, the first dude, the conservative guy, who basically said, people argue that there's some limitations with his approach, because while there's been advancements in research methodologies, there's still a fundamental problem of testing his kind of approach to conflict theory, and that some research studies test conflict theory are unable to distinguish between alternative explanations, and few attempts have been made to develop and test well-constructed conflict theories. Okay, moving on to additional critical theories. So these ones are really interesting. You have peacemaking criminology, which has incorporated 3 different intellectual traditions: religious, feminist, and critical. So generally, peacemaking criminology contends that rather than using punishment and retribution as a means of social control, society should attempt to, instead promote reconciliation through mediation and dispute settlement. So Harold Popinski and Richard Kinney have developed a model for peacemaking criminology that has 5 basic elements. They talk about social structure, crime, social harms, the criminal justice system itself, and of course, peacemaking alternatives. So there is a figure in the book that kind of looks at the ways in which these different factors form a sort of kind of overlapping Venn diagram, right? And so, there's really a need for reduction of social harm and promotion of peacemaking alternatives. So another theorist, John Wozniak, identified 3 predominant themes of peacemaking criminology: types of crime or social harms, types of peacemaking frameworks or perspectives, and types of peacemaking alternatives. So again, just trying to find different ways, because again, it comes back to, what is the purpose of our criminal justice system? Is it to kind of restore social order? Is it to punish or demonize? Is it to rehabilitate? Well, if we wanted to rehabilitate, then connecting people back to the social contract and to society is really a strong motivating factor. So to do that, sometimes peacemaking alternatives really are key. So this could involve sitting down with someone who harmed you and actually working through the process of mediation and saying, what can I do to repair the damage I've done to you? There's a really impactful video I used to use in this class that kind of goes into that, where a man who was shot by someone else, in a dispute, and became paralyzed as a result, talks to the guy and forgives him. And it's really interesting when you think about peacekeeping criminology, because sometimes we forget that the victims themselves, it doesn't end, right? Like, just because someone's convicted or sentenced, that doesn't mean it's over for that individual. So oftentimes, having this opportunity to kind of connect to someone, to hear what they have to say, and to hear their apologies can also be freeing for the victim. Okay, restorative justice perspective refers to the repair of justice by reaffirming a shared consensus of values involving a more joint or multi-sided approach. So this emphasizes the victim, the community, and the offender in a balanced approach. So there's a lot of retributive and restorative justice assumptions that are very different, so we'll go through that. So retributive and restorative justice assumptions are very different. So again, what does retributive mean? Just, kind of like the word retribution, right? Like revenge in a sort of way. Versus restorative justice, it's really looking beyond just the need for some sort of revenge and more about going back to that relationship between the victim and the offender, but also the community. Okay, so let's go through some of those assumptions that are in your book. So the first for retributive justice is that crime is an act against the state, a violation of a law, an abstract idea. But under the understanding of restorative justice, crime is an act against another person in the community. Under the heading of retributive justice, there's an assumption that the criminal justice system controls crime. Then an offender's accountability is defined as taking punishment. That crime is an individual act with individual responsibility. And so they believe that punishment is effective as a, threat of punishment can deter crime, and because punishment changes behavior. So again, this is all that retributive kind of revenge understanding of justice. So in this viewpoint, victims are really peripheral to the process. It's not about that. It's about punishing the offender. The offender is defined by deficits, and they focus on establishing blame or guilt. So there's an emphasis on a more adversarial relationship between, obviously, the state and the offender. And there's this imposition of pain to punish or deter or prevent future crimes. So the response is focused on the offender's past behavior, and it's very dependent upon proxy professionals in the criminal justice system. So again, going back to restorative justice very differently, they assume that instead of the criminal justice controlling crime, that crime control primarily lies within the community, and that accountability is defined as assuming responsibility and taking action to repair harm versus being punished. They also believe that crime has both individual and social dimensions of responsibility. So, punishment alone under restorative justice is not effective in changing behavior, and it's often disruptive to community harmony and good relationships. So, through that lens, victims are central to the process of resolving crime, not on the periphery. The offenders defined by their capacity to make reparation, to basically heal the harms that they've done. So the focus, instead of on blaming or guilting, is on problem solving or on liabilities or obligations in the future. So what should be done? And there's an emphasis on dialogue and negotiation. So oftentimes, instead of pain or punishment, restitution is instead suggested through this as a means of restoring both parties. And the goal, again, is reconciliation or restoration. So the response is focused on the harmful consequences of offender behavior, and there's an emphasis on the future of the community. So this means it's much more about direct involvement by the participants instead of the proxy professionals in the criminal justice system. So there's a figure in the book that kind of lays this out and shows how these viewpoints are very different, right, as a lens through which to understand these dynamics in the criminal justice system. So, restorative justice programs share some key principles, and it's really to, focus on the harms that are done and to find ways in which communities, where the community has faced a harm, to, offer some sort of restorative justice approach to create a way to kind of make up for that harm and then to heal that connection back to the community. Okay, and then left realism is, really largely coming from, at least the version of it in the book that they're talking about comes from the research from Jacques Young, who identified 4 major processes that have transformed criminological thinking. So one is the etiological crisis due to rising crime rates. So the second is the crisis in penalty in terms of the failure of prisoners, as well as a reappraisal of the role of police. So we'll break these down in a minute if you're like, what the hell is she talking about? The increased awareness of victimization in crime, which has previously been unnoticed, and a growing public demand and criticism of public service efficiency and accountability. So basically, left realism contends that previous criminological theories are incomplete because they're only looking at one part of crime, such as, for instance, like labeling theory is looking at the state, or control theory is looking at the public, or positivism is looking at the offender, or victimology is looking at the victim. And left realism is saying you really have to look at these things on all levels so that you can have a better sense of what's happening and have better goals that'll create better outcomes. And of course, that's going to help you develop a wide range of policy recommendations, of course, that are supposed to help you, actually deter crime, right, in the future. So, it's kind of interesting how when he talks about the thinking that's changed on crime, what's interesting is while violent crime rates have historically been dropping, it's not the public perception that that's the case, right? Because it's kind of all we hear about, especially when it comes to street crime, like the demonization of street crime. So, it's interesting that as a result of this and as more people are kind of having more information and, paying more attention, they start questioning, like, are we spending money on the right resources? Should we be funding police departments to have military-style equipment when we could be funding them to have social workers right along with them, or things of this nature, right? So you hear this kind of questioning of the system itself and its effectiveness and ability to actually deal with these issues. So realism is basically saying that unless we kind of take a step back and look at the full picture, then we're not going to be able to offer policy recommendations that are going to really address these issues. So speaking of policy recommendations, some policies related to labeling and conflict theories of crime. So if deviance amplification is a thing that we're seeing and we can measure, then the criminal justice system should try to divert some of the formal processing to avoid negative effects of labeling. That's a really wordy way of saying, if we know that the labeling process itself can often push people away from society and therefore almost encourage them to take on more deviant identities and often push them down a road of more criminality, then shouldn't we strive to divert people from that? And so some of these kind of policies will often, like for instance, for drug and alcohol policies, some of these ones are giving people opportunities to kind of go through like drug treatment instead of being put in the system, right? Or some policies have looked at more robust mental health treatment to keep people that otherwise are just going through mental health crises, and that's why they've acted in some sort of erratic or illegal way, and keep them out of that formal processing system as well. So again, we understand the process of how labeling works. Once you're labeled, you start to lean into that identity. So maybe if we don't do that, if we don't throw as many people in the system, we can deal with that in a better way. Okay, one of the things they talked about as well, policies related to conflict theory at least, is crack and cocaine legislation. So here, this is something we'll talk about a little bit later with New Jim Crow as well, because it's just such a blatant example of how unequal some of the policies are. I mean, some of the legislation has been to basically effectively police different communities differently. So for instance, with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, and basically also in 88, blah, blah, blah. You don't need to know the specific years, but basically what they did was establish this idea that there were different sentencing guidelines for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, right? So take a beat here. Who do we associate with using crack cocaine? Think about that. And it's not necessarily who actually uses it more. Hint, that's white people. But who do we think uses crack cocaine? Who is the media portraying as using crack cocaine? Again, we'll get into this more with New Jim Crow. Who do we assume uses crack cocaine? Oftentimes communities of color, and specifically poor communities of color, right? Now, who do we associate with powder cocaine? Think about it. Like if you close your eyes and imagine someone doing powder cocaine, it's probably like Wolf of Wall Street, rich white dude, executive, right? So, riddle me this, Batman. Why would people in charge of the system put in a law that says there's 100-to-1 difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine? So for instance, if you have 5 grams of crack cocaine, that was a mandatory minimum sentence of several years in prison, right? 5 grams is something that's going to easily fit in your pocket, right? Now, the 100-to-1 rule would say then that you need 500 grams of powder cocaine to reach that same mandatory minimum. Now, that's like a full-ass suitcase full of drugs, right? So very, very different as far as how much it costs, the kind of, think about just even in drug trafficking terms, the kind of levels or connections or networks you would have to go through to be able to come up with a couple grams of crack cocaine. That's like easy hand-to-hand street traffic kind of drug levels. But to come up with like a big old suitcase full of powder cocaine, you kind of got to know someone within a network. So anyway, when you think about that, why would conflict theorists challenge a law that says there's a 100-to-1 difference in guidelines? Do you know what the actual difference is between powder and crack cocaine? We're talking like baking soda and heat, right? But it's the social perception and who we connect to the drug. As we'll talk about, later with drugs as well, the kind of prohibition aspect of how we often associate communities that are marginalized with certain drugs, and then we criminalize the drugs so we can criminalize the community. So in this situation, conflict theorists have really challenged these sentencing laws because they say that the sentencing differences result in racial disparities, that they're unconstitutional because they deny equal protection or due process, the penalties constitute cruel and unusual punishment, and the statutes themselves are unconstitutionally vague. So again, this fits the purview of a conflict theorist because they're looking at how power
such as, having more wealth, having more affluence, can impact the ways in which people would actually encounter the criminal justice system, or the ways in which the laws can often be written to favor those who have more power, right? Those are the same people that line the pockets of the politicians that often propose these policies and get them passed. So again, they want to criminalize drug use in poor communities of color for very small amounts of drugs that you end up in prison for many years, while at the same time almost decriminalizing smaller amounts of powder cocaine, largely so their friends on Wall Street and their big, contributors that might be that kind of people that have suitcases full of drugs, would not face the kind of justice that, or the same kind of penalty that a poor person in a poor community of color would have to actually go through. So again, this is just, one example, but we're going to continue to talk about some other egregious examples in the system. So fun fact about that update. During the Obama administration, this came to a head, and he was like, we have to do something about this, 100 to 1, it's not fair. So they actually amended this, and now it is 18 to 1. So 18 to 1 ratio, meaning, you'd have to have 18 grams of powder cocaine for every one of crack cocaine. So by my math, that's still not equal. 18 and 1 are not equal. But in fairness, 18 is a hell of a lot lower than 100. But you can see how even when we talk about reforming these things, it often isn't even making it fair or equal. It's just making it less unfair, right? All right, so that wraps up our conflict theory and other labeling theory lecture.